Hello, and welcome to the Hello, I'm Grieving podcast. I am your host, Dr. Julie Shaw, founder of the Hello, I'm Grieving community, where we focus on acknowledging and dealing with grief to live a full life. Our tagline, Say Hello to Grief, emphasizes the importance of mindfully and courageously acknowledging and engaging with grief so we can find hope, lessons, motivation, and healing in the midst of our pain. Today, we have the opportunity to say hello to Gina Moffa. Gina is a licensed psychotherapist, mental health educator, and media consultant in New York City. In practice for nearly 2 decades, she has helped thousands of people seeking treatment for trauma, grief, as well as challenging life experiences and transitions. This includes work with Holocaust survivors at 92Y, as well as being a clinical director for Mount Sinai Hospital outpatient program specializing in addictions. She received her master's degree in social work with a specialty in trauma from New York University. And so it is my pleasure, and I've been waiting for this conversation to say hello to Gina. So thank you so much for being here today.
Hi, Julie. It's so great to be here and connected with you.
Yeah, I know we were just saying before we push record that this is like our actual first conversation. We've been meaning to to chat and to talk. So everybody's just going to experience our first conversation recorded, which is pretty awesome to capture those moments.
I'm
And
sure.
we just get to be curious and get to learn everything as much as we can in the time that we have. But definitely wanted to take the time to talk with you, especially since you have a book that was just launched and it's called Moving On Doesn't Mean Letting Go. So let's start there. Let's start there because I think books, resources like this, with all the knowledge that you have from your own experiences and being able to put it in this book is going to be able to help so many people. And this can be something that people look to, go out and get, absolutely add that to their reading list, and would love to hear, all the things behind this book and what brought it to fruition.
Oh, wow. Thank you. So many things brought it to a fruition. But I would say, during the pandemic, I was working more and more with people who were coming to me with different types of losses. It was so much loss coming to the surface that people had never experienced and different types of grief. And so it was a time that I felt I was teaching about grief and what, a grief experience might look like. And obviously it's different for everyone, but for me, it really inspired an idea that people don't actually understand what grief is, and they they live their lives by society's rules around it. And so I wanted to write something, or at least be a part of a conversation that became a bigger conversation in the world that would really highlight um, fresh grief and really talk about those moments. Something I call a grief fall, which is really those moments
I've loved
just
that term.
before.
I heard it. I was listening to an excerpt from your book, and it was that particular one about the grief fall. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's really interesting because people are like, what is it? What is that moment? And it's everyone can really understand this and has experienced it. The moment after a diagnosis, or the moment you get that phone call that your person that you love so much has died. It's that one moment where you realize that life will never be the same. And you're not necessarily grieving yet, but you're on the way there. It's the portal, it's that free fall where you feel yourself falling, but you have no idea where you will land. Um, and the brain fog and the physical symptoms and even the traumatic response that may come along with it, all of that felt to me really important to highlight and normalize and help people navigate. So that is my hope.
Yeah, yeah, I'm absolutely sure that that hope is real for folks, especially how you just talk about it and even how you're bringing to the conversation with the education piece, because I love educating folks. I know on my own journey, that was just so helpful and so powerful because I needed to seek out all the information. And so when we
Mhm.
have books like yours that are able to explain things, and especially with your background as a therapist, right, to bring that knowledge into it, but then also bring the language like terms like grief fall to where people can even visualize that and be able to even feel that, because sometimes that's what it can actually feel like. And that kind of brings us into our body as well to be able to understand that. And then when you talked about it as a portal, that's also like a big visual too, about us being transported into this other world. That's how I see it,
Yeah.
right? Because grief does bring us into this other world, and it ultimately changes how we view the world around us. And so I'm wondering, can you share a little bit about maybe your own grief story, and like how was your world changed and what was it like for you to go through that portal?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I lost my mom about 7 years ago, and at that time, I was a practicing therapist, doing work with grief and trauma and younger people. And I was I, for whatever reason, had this sense of I'm already a therapist, so I have the playbook on this. I already know how to deal with grief, so I'm cool. But what happened is that particular loss was the same week that I had three other major losses. And so, a job that I was working at closed pretty abruptly. So it was kind of while I was burying my mother, I'm finding out news that the location where I was a therapist and director was closing down. I went back home to my apartment building that had a notice under the door that it was being sold. And so it was like everything that felt safe was going and going rather quickly. And so for me, I felt like I didn't have the luxury to feel what I was feeling because I had to be in survival mode. And so I was pushing things away, thinking, all right, I'm a grief therapist. I work with trauma. I understand this. I know what's happening. I'm cool. Um, but it all caught up with me, and I really missed the mark when it came to the understanding of how physical grief can be. And
Yeah.
everything I was pushing away emotionally was showing up in my body.
Yeah.
And I wound up really very sick, which I write about in my book. And, saying I had my body on do not disturb, and yet it was knocking louder and louder. And I think for me, it was one of the things like that light bulb moment of, wow, I do this for a living and I really didn't understand, or I underestimated the physical symptoms that could come along with a major life and or significant loss.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, I think for me, that was probably the biggest challenge, outside of the devastation of losing my mother.
Yeah.
Um, and so,
Especially
yeah,
when it's
I'm
compounded like that, right? Like when you're talking about these multiple losses, one after the other. And sometimes that comes in the form of secondary loss as well, where people don't realize that that death could have been, or whatever pivotal or transitional moment in your life that carries that grief, that there's this domino and ripple effect. And for us
yeah.
to validate those losses as well and understand they are contributing to that initial catalyst for it.
Absolutely. And then, yeah, the ripple effects for sure. And then the ripple effects that come later on that, over time that you don't realize the symbolic losses that come with all of this. And people say, why is grief not finite? Why can't you just go through these stages, or why can't it just be 6 months? And this is a part of it because later on, so much of that symbolism of each loss comes right along with it too. And so you find yourself sideswept by all of the different angles and layers of our losses.
Yeah. You're making me think right now, because one of the things behind the name of Hello, I'm Grieving is even owning that as a part of your identity.
Mm,
um, and saying, yes, I am grieving, and that it isn't finite, and this will be something that is carried with you throughout your whole life. I'm wondering, how do you view grief as a part of someone's identity, and how do you, I guess, coach people or help people as you are working with them?
I think it's a really hard thing to tell people who don't know that grief will be with them forever.
Hmm.
And so I think that the way that I work in my practice is to be really gingerly about it, which is not to have any expectations about it coming or going. But that kind of, there's an understanding that it will be there in different ways and in different formats and will be stronger and may lessen in intensity. Um, and that's as far as I go. And I never really say, I hate to tell you this, but your grief is going to be with you forever, because they're coming with so much anxiety and
Yeah.
perhaps trauma and so much distress. And they already feel like it's this black tunnel, dark
Yeah.
tunnel with no light at the end of it. And so I really like to focus on what, not necessarily the idea of finding meaning, but bringing in life again and
Yes.
bringing in
Yeah.
a sense of redefining a relationship to what or whom they've lost and how that can bring comfort, or finding comfort in different ways with carrying forward or not, right? Depending on the relationship to their loss.
Yes. Yeah. That
But
relationship's big too, because sometimes it's like grief isn't always all lovey dovey, and
right.
there's very complicated relationships in life and in death.
Absolutely. And I think, I don't always assume automatically that when people say they lost their mom, I say, oh my God, I'm so sorry to hear that. That must be a huge loss, right? Because that's my assumption, and assumptions are always really the wrong way to go. But I think it's important to explore that and give people the opportunity to let you know, before we go into that spiel of what grief is. There's a lot of grief is love.
Yeah.
And sometimes it isn't.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. It's always it's I do inclusion work as well, so it's really understanding how can we include all voices and all experiences. And I think that's very important in the grief space, to be able to acknowledge that is there can be this image of positivity and love and all of that, especially after the death of someone, right? Of a person. Um, but the complicated nature of us as human beings is that there's going to be so many other things that are woven into it. So whether it is, and I think it's the comedian Jeanette McCurdy, maybe, that wrote the
Yeah.
book, I'm Glad My Mom Died.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was so bold of her, because she did want to express something that a lot of people don't talk about, is all these other emotions and feelings surrounded, connected to the relationship of the person that's died as well.
Absolutely. I love that book. I think it's so important that we give a voice to the most complicated types of loss, which is when you have a relationship, but there wasn't time to sort things through to come to a place of love or forgiveness or whatever it is that we hope to sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
But that's real. And I'll be honest with you, even in my own work, there's a really large number of people that come saying, you know what, I know I'm supposed to be sad and I know I feel grief, but the grief I feel is over the relationship we never got to have,
Wow.
and the love that I never felt from this person or my parent or my ex-spouse, whatever it may be. And that becomes the grief that they carry. And
Yeah.
so it's really important to acknowledge that, and I hate to say it because it's so wonderful to say grief is love, and it
Mm-hmm.
is,
Mm-hmm.
but grief is sometimes sadness, and sometimes it's a void of what could have been,
Yeah.
and
Which
sometimes it's
is,
injustice, and
yeah.
it's a lot of different things.
Mm-hmm. Which is so important to talk about. It's making me wonder, do you think that, and even how you're saying that we're grieving the relationship that could have been, do you feel that, and again, I'm talking about a person that has died, do you think that there's always some form of grief there for that person? I know that's kind
Grief,
of a big question,
I
but
feel like a lot of it is for hopes,
mm-hmm.
dashed hopes. I can't say that I've personally heard that if it's been an abusive relationship of any kind, the grief is of the person as opposed to the grief of either what could have been, what
Yeah.
didn't happen, or the grief of not having a voice to stop
Mm-hmm.
or the courage to stop, or, that kind of thing.
Or
or
losing
the grief.
yourself in that relationship, right?
Absolutely. I was just about to say that. Yeah.
Mhm.
And a lot of the work is about forgiveness of self,
Mm.
and not of that person necessarily.
Yeah.
Um, and so because of the loss of self. And I
Yeah.
think we don't acknowledge that enough.
Yeah. And that's a big one, right? Um,
Yeah, I mean, I
yeah, it
talk about in my book about, grief through, looking back through grief-colored glasses, and how we're really taught as a society to put people on pedestals and not quote unquote speak ill of the dead.
Mhm.
And yet, we perpetuate violence, we perpetuate abuse, we perpetuate lies. And how
Mhm.
does somebody heal if they can't tell the truth?
Yeah.
So
That's the
it's
big part
important.
right there, right? Is if we can't talk about it, how can we get it out? How can we work on that forgiveness or working to move through this and get to that other side of the portal, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Um, I want to know, especially since you work with like grief informed therapy. I know you have different modalities with like CBT, trauma informed. I would love for listeners to know, what are the different types of therapy that people can look for that maybe would be a good opportunity for them to like look into more. Because sometimes we just say therapy, but
Hmm.
we don't really know what type could serve us better. Um, and so I would love it, whether it's like I think it's EMDR, those
Hmm.
different types of pathways, and kind of give like a brief description of what you're familiar with, so that folks listening can know, oh, like I've never thought about that. Maybe that could be something I look into.
Absolutely. I think, long ago we used to see any kind of therapy, including grief therapy, to be more of the talk therapy, neck up type of therapy, as I call it, which CBT falls into. I think there are some people I work with that prefer to just talk. Um, they're more comfortable with that because they're not as comfortable getting into their bodies. However, I don't believe that we can do the best healing work, quote unquote, without including our bodies,
Mm.
because grief is a full body experience and it will affect us head to toe. And so I think it's really important to include in some way body work, whether that is doing EMDR, eye movement desensitization, and reprocessing therapy, which really works with bilateral stimulation of our brains and helps us to rewire and take the sting out of a incredibly distressing event. Whether that's loss, trauma, there's a lot of different life events that it could be really helpful. I really do find EMDR to be incredibly helpful if there's something that somebody is replaying and ruminating over again and again that continues to bring nightmares or intense anxiety. That can be a really, really helpful place to go, as well as brain spotting, which is incredibly similar. There's a little bit less talking involved and a lot more action with stimulating the brain. Um, and
And
so I
how and
think,
how are we stimulating the brain? What are maybe some things that are done? Because I haven't heard of brain spotting, so that,
okay,
yeah.
it's really about placing our eyesight. So with EMDR, for example, Francine Shapiro founded it by sitting in a park and thinking of something distressing, and she noticed that she was following a tree branch moving very quickly, and that when she was sort of getting up from the bench, whatever she was thinking about was far less distressing. And she was really curious about this and created an entire body of research that talked about sort of the ways that our at that time it was our eye movement, right? So she was following the tree branch sort of back and forth, um, but the way that we can move our eyes to stimulate parts of our brains, which then could rewire something that would
Wow.
be incredibly traumatizing. And brain spotting is very, very similar. The difference is really in a lot of the telling of stories and sort of the way that the method is. There's many different steps with EMDR. It's a little bit simpler with brain spotting, but it's really working with both sides of the hemisphere and our eyes and using our eyes.
Hmm.
Um, somatic types of therapy. I don't personally do them at this particular time, but I am getting training, so I'm excited about that.
I'm always
But
very interested in somatic, right? Like even
yeah,
understanding like where we carry it in our body and being able to find those
absolutely.
release points. So yeah, go ahead, continue speaking about
100%.
that.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm more into sort of the wisdom of whatever our bodies feel good with. So, I have somebody I'm working with who wants to talk but also wants to do, grief informed, trauma informed yoga. And, or there's art therapies that people are, taking classes that are more grief art classes. So I'm seeing more and more therapists, like art therapists, for example, doing more work with a specialty like grief or trauma. So it gets people still getting that, getting something out of their body and using that. Interactive journaling is the same kind of, a new method that's a couple of years old that has a lot of research, and even just the idea of journaling having a really profound therapeutic effect. And I know it sounds so simple, but you're still getting something out of your body. And so
Absolutely.
it's, for me, it's just really important to include the body in whatever modality of therapy you're in. And if you don't feel comfortable, it could be as easy as taking a walk, or, a mindfulness walk, just noticing things around you and getting very centered, putting your hand on your heart and just asking yourself what you may need.
Yeah.
Um, so it's really just including the body. And I really don't think that you could do any kind of grief informed or trauma informed therapy, number one, without creating safety, but number two, without including the body.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm a former professional athlete, so it's for me just I've noticed a lot how it is connected to the body and understanding the importance of our body.
Yeah.
So that's something, and I think it made me even reflect how you were like, I'm a therapist. I should know how to deal with grief. And I've always lent, kind of leaned on my athletic career to saying like, I know how to deal with hard things. Like I know how to pick myself up. I know how to like take on a challenge.
Yeah.
Where sometimes, when I was met with grief, I was like, this is a whole other ball game. Like this is a whole other
It really is.
challenge.
Yeah.
And granted, I did have some tools, I feel like that, which maybe you're probably thinking about that too, as a therapist, like you can understand different things, but at the same time, there were things that I just needed to either unlearn or just learn a different way and be open to that. um as I am still grieving, right? I look at this, for me, it's something that I know, like what you were talking about earlier, it might lessen, it's going to ebb and flow. I'm just going to be able to carry it a lot better.
Yeah.
I'm going to be able to laugh when I talk about things now. And it's, that's always my goal. And again, people have different goals, but just being able to show people that, and but also being very realistic that there's going to be different factors that go into it. But then also it does take a lot of action and it does take a lot of work. And that work can be very, very tough.
Mhm.
How do you, I guess, help folks see that aspect of, and this is therapy, kind of what I've been told about therapy is like it's going to be hard before it gets easy. And how do you continue to help people and serve people and kind of guide them through those really hard, difficult times, and how do you carry that for yourself, because it's a lot of work to do the work that we do in serving those folks that are grieving.
It really is. You're right. I think almost in both cases, it's allowance. People who reach out for help usually are coming to me or reaching out for help because the way that they're doing it isn't working and they're looking for relief. And so almost you're coming in with somebody who's not necessarily resistant in a lot of ways to whatever the suggestions are. But I think first and foremost, it's creating an allyship that whatever it is, if it feels like you're taking two steps back because you were, a grief memory was reawakened and now you can't stop crying or can't get out of bed for 3 days, that you feel safe enough with whomever you're working with, that you can know that you're not regressing and that you're not starting back from square one. But, I think it is the allowance of whatever comes up to come up. And so, whether that's the good days or the bad days, people are afraid to feel really bad and they're afraid to feel really good in
Yeah,
grief
I love
because
that. Yeah.
society will judge you either way. If you look like you're having fun or you post a photo of yourself at a concert, everyone's going to assume that you're great and that you're not grieving anymore and you feel good and everything's in the past. And if you are too quote unquote bad or too much of a mess, according to society, they're going to say, wow, she really needs help. I hope she gets that help. Like I don't want to be too close to that. And
Hmm.
so there's really, and there's very few, I want to say there's very few mental health challenges out there that you have to have such a delicate balance in order to have support or feel supported in such a way that you can't be too much of one thing. And the truth is, with grief, you will be all of it. It's a
Yeah.
spectrum.
Yeah.
And so I think first for me, it's sort of teaching people, like we talked about earlier, what things might look like. And, and that, yes, it's different for everyone, but, you may find that on this day there's this feeling, or this day there's this need, or this day you won't know what your needs are.
I feel
And
that. There's a
yeah,
lot of times when I'm just like, I don't know what I want. I don't know what I need.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the truth is so many people then punish themselves or berate themselves or bully themselves or assume that they're not doing well. And I think we have to include it all. That grief work is the good days, the bad days, the days we don't know what we want, the days we don't know what we need, the days we want to, go to something we planned, but then realize we can't and need a plan
Hmm.
B and C. And so I think, when people work with me, it's sort of about teaching them to normalize
Yeah.
their experience, but also helping to find tools when they um, want to reflect, or when they get sort of stuck in a rumination, or when they, when they don't know what next step to take. And I think if they feel like they're not alone, that is to me kind of the biggest factor in getting through the work, quote unquote, because I think when we feel like we're flailing alone in the dark and
Hmm.
we feel so out of our body and out of our minds, and we don't feel like we're tethered to anything because maybe the person we lost was the person we felt tethered to, um, that is the most important thing in any kind of healing companionship.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I call it companionship because we need companionship in healing. We're really, we can't get far without another mirroring, co-regulating, safe person to witness and care for us and
Yeah.
validate us.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And sometimes that's probably the best support people can give, right? Is to
yeah,
just sit there, be that witness, and to just not judge and give that person that free space to just be who they are in that moment, and just understand that it's the grief coming through, and they need that expression. Sometimes that's what I tell folks when they're like, I don't know how to support them, and I was like, you really don't need to do too much. Like just sit there.
it's so
But
true.
yeah, yeah, I
I
can
think we
make it.
get so, yeah,
Go
sorry.
ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say we get so caught up in either doing the right thing or how we should show up, and how not to be afraid to show up, that
Mhm.
we get it wrong so much of the time.
Yeah.
And
We
so
just
what you
think
just
about it
said,
too
yeah,
much. Yeah, we're overthinking it, or we think it's going to be this item or this thing, this physical thing that we can present to them and take to them. And I think it goes back to that uncomfortable feeling that people don't want to sit in that discomfort. And to be honest, then it becomes about them versus the other person, which is not what we
100%.
want, right? You did mention tools earlier, and I would love to ask maybe what's one of your favorite tools or one of the best tools that you feel like you've come across or that you pass on to folks, that kind of helps them.
Lately, it feels like there's a lot of, I want to say, of guilt or of rumination
Hmm.
or of longing, for a different outcome. And so, most recently, there's been a lot of, and this is very simple, but very detailed and pointed, targeted letter writing.
Okay, yeah.
And so I've been doing a lot of that recently, and it seems so it seems so simple, but it's really moved people out of a place where they were sort of in this sticky little pit of what was or what their fears were or of what they were angry at, for example, to sort of a new place. And it seems to be right now, and I have different tools at different times. But this one, although simple, has been really incredibly powerful for so many people in my practice right now.
Yeah, I remember when I was in group, when I was after my sister died, I knew, and when we were talking about to do this in community or that you need to find your people and to have that there in your healing, which I'm a firm believer in,
Yeah,
is to find all again these different modalities of what can help you. And group was really helpful for me. In conjunction with my individual one-on-one therapist that I was going
yeah,
to as I was like, I need all the help. Um, and we did some letter writing, and that has always stuck with me. And I love this tool, and I've just explored other ways that I could use this even when I'm helping folks, right? Is that, taking people through a letter to that person, or even I love the reverse of that is a letter from that person. So you're
yeah.
speaking as if it's that person writing to you. Even playing with this idea of giving grief a character and to understand who or what grief is, and writing a letter to grief and being able to kind of get that out. And actually
Mhm.
was able to do this with alongside some other facilitators the other day and witness what came out of it. And it was just beautiful to see, one, what people wrote, but then it was also very interesting. And you could tell that there was a shift just in that moment for folks to really sit in those feelings of understanding, can I even write to grief? Can I even face grief
Mm,
at this moment? Do I even want to talk to the grief? Because I am so angry at it right now, which is
yeah,
very valid. And so sometimes it's not even in the act of writing, but even in the concept of trying to give grief this construct and trying to figure out what is my relationship with grief.
yeah,
And so yes, I'm all about the letter writing and putting that out there, because there's so many different ways that we can use that. And even listening, to some other authors and podcasts is thinking about, even we may have to write letters to our younger self, you know,
yeah.
because that's all the inner child work that we're doing.
Hmm.
And being able to understand that sometimes we don't give ourselves the grace or the love that we need. But if we were to talk to our inner child, that, like, what letter would we write to them to comfort them? And I think that can be something that we need to remind ourselves that that's how we need to treat ourselves now and give ourselves that type of attention and love and grace and non-judgment now. So that's my tangent.
Hmm.
But you
Well,
made me
this
think of all that.
that was a well said, well needed tangent. Absolutely. No, all of that. And I love that in a group setting also because of the witnessing of a whole
Mhm.
community.
Yeah.
It's that is so powerful. And that in and of itself is such a powerful tool.
Mhm.
But I love even the continuation of different letters at different iterations of our lives and different milestones. And it's always very individual, but I'm really just with all of the science out there and with all of these complicated methods and everything, sometimes it really is just quietly getting in touch with these different parts of ourselves, right? And getting things out onto paper and reaching inward
Yeah.
just for all of those complicated feelings
Mhm.
and learning.
Yeah, because I would say, we probably bury things in ourselves that we don't even want to face. But when we do find this way to, like you said, get it out on paper, something as simple as that, then guess what? We have to look at it now. We can read it back and understand that came from us. Like that
Yeah,
came from me. And and I think this can also be something that's challenging for folks, right? Because um depending again on where you are at, right? And always being conscious of meeting people where they're at in their journey. I know it has taken me such a long time, which I did not expect because I used to journal. But when my sister died, I could not. And I immediately I was like, oh, I should write about this. I know the benefits, get it out on paper, but I could not do it. I
Yeah.
and that block was because I knew if I did write it, it would make it very real that my sister had died. And so I'm sure there's other people out there that maybe feel the same and could be surprised by some of the
Mhm.
blocks that come up that we did not recognize or realize what would happen, especially how you were talking about. I didn't realize, the body aspect of it and how that would have an effect.
It's so true. And also, I mean, I know I mentioned it earlier, but I won't use this right in the beginning of working with anyone. I think it's really important that someone feels safe enough, because if they're not going to feel safe enough to look at something and being witnessed, I mean, that could be really dangerous. We're pushing people then to look at things before they're ready to. And so you have a valid point. It is really important to feel it out. It's got to be the right time to visit it. Um,
Yeah.
and so, yeah, I mean, it could be good in a group setting. In my work, I don't do it right off the bat for
Yeah.
sure. Like,
That's probably something we
it's
should say to folks is like maybe give yourself some time.
Yeah, so
And
I'm
yeah.
glad you mentioned that, because
Yeah.
for me, when I talked about safety earlier, we can't just assume we're a safe space. We have to allow somebody who's coming to see us to define what safety looks like to them. And it's something we cultivate over time and with trust and with consistency. And only then, really then and only then, is when we can start to experiment with different things, even including body work.
Yeah.
So, or even suggesting it, because we don't know if people feel safe in their bodies, right? So we've got to start there. We have to start with that, creating a safe place, to even then look at grief, to
Yeah.
give grief a voice,
Mhm.
or to talk to it, like you were saying earlier.
Yeah.
So it's just
Yeah.
important to mention that.
Yeah. Because even like I'm very conscious, like I'm this whole say hello to grief, right? Like how can you acknowledge it? How can you um in a sense like say, okay, I'm ready, right?
Hmm.
And oftentimes that first step of acknowledgement can be very hard. And so I also recognize that to when we're ready to be able to do that, it can be very, very challenging. And when we do, then it opens up a whole other set of challenges that can come along with it. But it is a long road, and there's again different resources that we can tap into to help us along that road, which I hope people are hearing today and listening, because you've dropped a lot of knowledge, which is amazing. And it's so good to be able to spread this knowledge and help others. Um, when you are talking about, and you've mentioned a lot about trauma and grief, um, I'm also trying to figure out, I guess, maybe what do you feel like are the similarities between grief and trauma? Maybe what are the differences? Because I think there could be this misconception that because you're grieving, there is trauma, but maybe that's not the case. Or with trauma, there's always grief, right? So can you kind of clear up that kind of mystery or entanglement with grief and
Yeah.
trauma and how people think sometimes they're always bonded together?
Yes. It is different for everybody. I'll say that. There is most always grief with trauma, because there's always that before and an after. There's the loss of something. Um, and so that's why that's a given. When it comes to grief, it really has a lot to do with a couple of things. The type of loss is one of them, right? Was it sudden? Was it unexpected? Is it ambiguous? Is there a loss with no closure, an estrangement, something like that? Um, do you have a history of anxiety? Do you have a history of being, unable to cope with hard things? What is your resiliency like? Some people are born with a little bit of a weaker set of coping skills for various reasons, and no judgment on that whatsoever, because we can learn it along the way. But if you come into the world with that, you're already sort of set up to be a little more traumatized by something really profound in your life. Um, Again, it's the attachment also. What is my attachment to what I've lost? Did I rely on it for my livelihood or my safety? or my well-being in any way, because if I lose that, that is a big trauma, you know? And so these are some of the things that I look at when I'm talking to somebody. But, you know, historically, our colleagues have, you know, categorized a traumatic loss as something that felt very vague to me. You know, what I talked about earlier was like a sudden, unexpected, ambiguous loss, violent. But, you know, I go by people's nervous systems. Our
Okay.
nervous system is, you know, wired to tell us when there's danger. It's a smoke alarm system. And so if somebody comes to me and they say they feel traumatized by something, I'm going to inquire about that. You know, what are their coping skills? What is their anxiety adrenaline level like at its basis, you know, at its base? And so what was the attachment history? What was their safety involved? I mean, there's a lot of different factors that we have to look at that will make an individual feel more traumatized by a loss. And it will always affect their nervous system. And I can't tell somebody that what they're experiencing as traumatic is not.
Yeah.
I have to gauge it based on a lot of questions that I will poke around with. And, you know, but first and foremost, understand that when I hear that word or they allude to something being traumatizing, that safety is first and foremost.
Mm-hmm.
And understanding that we need a consistent, safe place is going to be important for them to even begin to explore that. But I never would say to someone, oh, you know, your parent was sick for 9 years. This wasn't a traumatic loss for you. Like, you know, that
Yeah.
wasn't a trauma. That's completely harmful and unethical. I think it's important to help people tease it out on their own, but also to understand what the meaning was of this loss for them. And I think there are so many things we can't just assume without jumping in and getting details and really understanding the way somebody processes things in life or the way that their homeostasis is, you know? And it's just really important for us to get all of the information before we decide to label something as traumatic or not. And so I think that's, you know, that's where I stand with it. But I'm never going to tell somebody that they are not experiencing anything traumatic. Their nervous system is something that I have to get to know, and that will tell me, you know, where they're at. And
Yeah.
so that's just important to know.
Yeah. Because I think it's important to validate that for folks. Sorry, I have a little bit.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
You want some water?
Um, no, I have some right here. Um, because I think it's important, and maybe you actually help people understand that, yeah, this was a very traumatic experience, for you. And I think people need to hear that because when someone does die, and again, depending on the way that it happened, or again, all these other factors, is that there can be pieces of that does traumatize them.
Yeah.
So I think people absolutely need to understand this. I think it's something I'm learning more about because I think for me, I there's definitely been trauma in my life, but was I willing to say that and own that?
Mm.
And that's been something that has been a little challenging because again, I'm your classic overachiever. So it's like I'm your classic overachiever. I'm always going to do this, but I think there can be shame attached to that. That there can be shame
Mm.
to say like, yes, I have had trauma in my life, because if I own that, then what are the judgments that people will have against me? Or most importantly, like the judgments that I would carry again for myself.
Hmm.
And to also say it's okay to own this, so that now if I own this, then I can work through it and be able to continue the process.
Absolutely. And,
Yeah.
you know, I'm feeling like things like trauma are getting less and less stigmatized because people are starting to actually accept that they have been through traumas. And, you know, I would sort of venture to say that nearly everyone has had some kind of traumatic situation or witnessing or event in their life that they could think of on the spot right now that changed them, that had a before and after effect for them, or that changed the trajectory of their life.
I would agree.
Um,
Hmm.
and so I think that the more we can recognize that, the more we can snip the shame out of it because everyone has experienced it, right? just like everyone has experienced anxiety, at least acutely before.
For sure.
And, you know,
Yeah.
for more and more people to actually admit it, you know, the safer it becomes to talk about it out loud. And then, you know, shame can't live in the dark.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
so that's my hope, even with, you know, traumatic losses. You know, the thing that makes trauma and grief's relationship so sticky is that a loss, depending on the kind of loss, depending on where you are in your life, there's so many factors that I talked about a little bit earlier. It can reawaken old trauma. It can reawaken an old loss. And it then can make something feel so much bigger and more complicated, and more emotional, and much more distressing than maybe it would have if we had never gone through something. And
Yeah.
so I think what it does is it reawakens everything else. And then we're feeling the effects of all of those other sort of unprocessed, unmetabolized traumas in our lives.
Hmm.
And that's what sort of makes it a little bit deeper to work with.
Yeah. And then again, those connections between both of them and understanding that relationship.
Yeah. I
I
talk about it a little bit in my book in chapter 5.
okay.
Grief
Oh,
sister trauma. Oh,
see?
geez.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Because there is that relationship there, right? And so, I mean, I am going to be ordering your book and making sure that I get all and every piece of bit of information out of it, and be sharing that with others as well through the community and through this podcast. I'm very
Thank you.
thankful that you're able to take the time today to just again drop all this knowledge on everybody. And I'm sure there's so much more to be able to contribute. I did want to leave space though, thinking about your book is, we all have these goals in mind when we set our eyes on this big vision. But I want to know what is your vision for your book? Like, what do you envision for yourself with this book? I'm all about
Hmm.
manifesting and putting things out there to the universe. So I would just love to know what is your vision for your book?
Oh my goodness. If you asked me that last year, I would say to finish it. um, but you know, one of the things, and I love our grief community, and so many people actually are coming out with books. Um, when I first was writing this book, my goal was to write something that was geared towards emerging adults in a fast-paced society. It is really for anybody who is looking to navigate loss in the moment, and get to understand what their experience is. But my hope was also just to be a part of the conversation,
Mm,
and to be another voice, with other brilliant, amazing voices in our community, at the table, really as a large community, destigmatizing grief, helping to change policies, and bringing people to a place where they can find healing in the company of others and in community. And you know, whether that's disenfranchised grief, you know,
mhm,
and really just bringing to light different kinds of losses that people don't acknowledge or don't feel like they can acknowledge because they don't feel safe enough. So it's really bringing out loss into the light,
yeah.
and being a part of the conversation. You know, I just hope that at some point my book is one that someone will also choose.
Mm, yeah, and gift to other people, right?
I would
To be
love
able
it.
to pass that on, which is beautiful. Thank you for sharing
Yeah,
that with us. And you're a part of the conversation today, and I'm glad you can share your voice with us and others. I
I so
do have
appreciate that.
two. I do have two questions that I ask everybody that comes on the podcast. So, let's go ahead and start with question number one. So,
Uh-oh.
question number one is, if you were to say hello to someone today who is grieving, what would you say to them?
Oh. Mostly, I see you, I care, I'm here, let's walk this. Yeah, I think that's it. I think
Yeah.
sometimes we complicate it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's beautiful. The second question is, if you were to say hello to your own grief today, what would you say?
It's funny how I want to start out with, bitch, shut up.
I
Right?
love that. People have said the most amazing things, and I love it to this question.
It's like, it is really funny because it's kind of like, oh, now is not the time. It's funny how we give permission slips for other people, and then when it comes to us, it's like, shh, I don't have time for this. Like, I've
Yes.
got things to do. Like, come on, like, and
Yes.
really come at her. But yeah, I feel like that would be my inclination right now, just because I'm a little bit busy with things.
Uh-huh. I got
But
things to
but
do.
yeah, but that's everyone, right? And that's actually the point of my book, is that we don't make time for loss and we don't make time for grief. So I'm enacting that right now in myself, which is real,
Mm-hmm.
because it comes whether or not we want it to. And
Yeah.
so yeah, I would say, okay, I'm here. I'm
Yeah.
here. I see you.
I got a couple minutes for you.
I
And
have
then
a
you gotta
couple
shut up.
minutes. I know. I do from time to time at least put my hand on my heart and just say, I feel it. I feel
Oh,
you.
that's
And
good.
that's it. It's just a quick acknowledgement at the very least.
Yeah. And I think that's just a beautiful way to kind of even come to a close, right? Is like ultimately it's how we're building this relationship, not only with us, but with our grief and
Absolutely.
being able to have that relationship. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm so thankful for people like you making that possible for the mainstream and, for more people to have access to this permission.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Let everybody know all the places that they can say hello to you, and where they can find you, where they can buy your book, all of it. So your
Oh my goodness.
time, let them all know.
Oh, I would love it if you would say hello to me. You can find me on the Instagram at Gina Moffa LCSW. I am on Facebook also at Gina Moffa LCSW. And my website is ginamoffa.com. And I am always deeply welcoming of questions, comments, all of that. So I mean it when I say I want a community and to be a part of a community. So please reach out.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I'd like to, just thank you for being a member. And I'm just going to place you in the Hello, I'm Grieving community because
I'm
you're always
grateful.
welcome.
Thank you so much, Julie.
Yes, thank you. So I'm going to close out today. I'm going to say a few words. And again, thank Gina for being here with us today. But if grief has taught me anything, it is that time is our most valuable resource. So again, thank you everybody listening, and to Gina for giving us your time today. Thank you for taking the time to say hello to grief. And there are so many people in this world grieving the loss of someone or something. And it's not my goal to reach every single one of them. It's simply to reach one. And I hope that person is you. I hope that you take at least one thing from listening today that helps you on your journey, and take the time to say hello to your grief today. And better yet, say hello to someone else, because you never know who you'll be greeting in their grief. And I would love to say hello to everyone listening. So you can find me on every social media outlet, basically at Hello, I'm Grieving, and my website at helloimgrieving.com. So until next time, I look forward to saying hello.